All right, let's dive in. Today, we're going deep into 1970s America. But not just any trip. We're focusing on what it was like to be a student back then.
Ah, the 70s. Yeah, a time of some serious style, some serious change, too.
Well, we're working with what seems to be someone's notes, personal notes, I think, on 70s and 80s student life. Lots of fashion stuff in here. Bell bottoms, big hair, but also strict dress codes. I'm intrigued already.
That's the 70s, all right. Full of contradictions. That free spirit from the 60s, it was still there, but things were getting a little more polished, too.
So, like, ripped jeans and hoodies were a no-go. Man, this is going to be interesting.
Yeah.
And no smartphones? I can't even imagine. We'll have to explore how teenagers connected before social media. Oh, and get ready for some serious nostalgia. Arcades, drive-in movies, the whole bit.
It's wild to think about, right? How those limitations could lead to different kinds of, creativity, resourcefulness.
Okay, let's kick things off with fashion. Paint us a picture. What were the students wearing back then?
Well, it wasn't all tie-dye and platforms, I mean, some of that free-flowing, rebellious style from the 60s was still around, that hippie look. But other influences were starting to creep in.
Like, what, was disco making a splash yet?
Yeah, exactly. Glam rock and disco, those brought a whole new level of flair to the scene. Imagine rocking bell-bottoms and a psychedelic print top one day, then boom, Friday night, you're in a fitted suit with an open shirt ready for the disco.
Talk about a style evolution. Sounds like there was room to really express yourself. What about accessories? Were peace signs still a thing? Flowers in the hair?
Think more like headbands, aviator sunglasses, long necklaces. And personalization was huge. Denim jackets covered in patches and pins. They'd show off their favorite bands, or even their political leanings.
Okay, so fashion was a statement, but we're still seeing some formality. What about the school environment itself? Anything like the movies, minus the singing and dancing, of course.
Well, this is where it gets interesting. Compared to today, school clothes were surprisingly formal. Think dress pants, collared shirts, long skirts, even in public schools.
Wow, really? That's a far cry from the jeans and t-shirts I see kids wearing these days.
Yeah, total shift in mindset. And it wasn't just public schools. Private and religious schools, forget it. They often had uniforms, strict ones, really sticking to that traditional look.
So much for the rebellious 70s, huh?
Yeah.
Were there any places students could, express themselves more freely through their clothes?
College campuses were definitely more relaxed. Denim, turtlenecks, leather boots. Think more of a, intellectual vibe.
Yeah, that makes sense. College is like a time for figuring out who you are, what your style is. But can you imagine showing up to high school in jeans and a t-shirt back then? Detention for sure.
It really shows you how much things have changed, when it comes to clothes and what's acceptable. Now it's all about comfort and expressing yourself, especially in places like schools.
All right, so we've got the fashion down. But I gotta know, what about the social scene? No cell phones, no social media. How do these kids even function?
That's what's so interesting about this time, right? Without that constant digital connection, face-to-face interaction was everything. Breaks between classes, that's when you actually talked and connected with people.
Wait, you mean they use their voices to communicate? Crazy!
It sounds weird now, I know. But it had a huge impact. You had to rely on direct communication, body language, and the things you did together out in the real world.
Yeah, I'm starting to think maybe I was born in the wrong decade. So if they weren't staring at their phones all day, what did they actually do?
Extracurricular activities were a big deal. Debate clubs, sports, theater, music. I mean, these weren't just hobbies. These were like vital for fitting in, making friends.
Just like those old movies where everyone's joining clubs, right?
Yeah.
Trying to find their place. Some things never change, I guess.
Yeah, true. But I bet the activities themselves were pretty different.
Oh, for sure. No video games, no streaming, no endlessly scrolling the internet. What did they do for fun? Did they just sit around and, stare at each other?
Uh-huh. Not exactly. Think classic arcade games. Pac-Man, Donkey Kong, Space Invaders. Spending hours in those dark, noisy arcades trying to beat your friends' high scores. That was peak 70s entertainment.
Now, that's a blast from the past. And what about drive-in theaters? Were they really as cool as they sound?
Picture this. You pile in the car with your buddies, grab some popcorn, and watch a movie under the stars. It was really something else. Drive-ins were a totally unique experience. You had freedom, but you were also sharing the experience with everyone else. It's hard to find anything like it today.
Man, I'm getting jealous. But was it all arcades and drive-ins? Did these kids ever just, hang out?
Of course. Shopping malls were huge in the 70s, especially for teenagers. They were social hubs, a place to see and be seen. That's where the term mall rat came from,
So the mall was like the 70s version of social media, a place to connect, check out what's trending, maybe do a little showing off.
Exactly. And don't forget the music. Listening to vinyl records and cassette tapes was like a whole ritual. Kids would spend hours recording their favorite songs off the radio, making mixtapes for their friends.
There's just something about holding a record in your hands, right? You don't get that same connection with digital music.
Totally agree. It was a different experience back then, more intentional. People really appreciated the art of music.
All right, so we've got arcades, drive-ins, malls, mixtapes. What else was shaping these kids' minds back then?
Oh, well, television was a huge influence. Happy Days, Starsky and Hutch, Charlie's Angels, Saturday Night Live. Those were cultural icons.
Yeah, those are classics.
Yeah.
But how did they even watch TV back then? Wasn't it all fuzzy screens and rabbit ears?
Well, cable was just starting to catch on, so most families were still using antennas to get their channels. And no streaming or recording either. If you missed your show, you missed it.
That's pressure. What about movies? Was it all disco musicals and crime dramas?
Lots of variety, of course. But the 70s is when you started seeing those big blockbuster films, The ones with crazy special effects. Star Wars, Jaws.
So, they were living in a world just starting to get all this new technology, but still very much stuck in those older ways. It's a fascinating time.
Yeah, it gives you a different perspective. I mean, we think of the 70s as this simpler time, but there was so much going on, so much change happening.
This is way more than just a fashion flashback, that's for sure. We're getting a real glimpse into a whole different way of life.
And this is just the beginning. We've got so much more to uncover about the world of 1970s students. Speaking of change, we can't forget about the music. The 70s had some incredible music, don't you think?
Oh, absolutely. Time to cue up the soundtrack for this deep dive, Robert. So what were students listening to back then?
Well, you had it all, really. Mellow folk rock, high-energy punk, and of course, disco was having its moment. Those infectious beats, the whole glam look.
I can practically hear the platform shoes hitting the dance floor now. Anything else shaping the scene?
Oh, yeah. Heavy metal was starting to come up, too. Bands like Led Zeppelin, Black Sabbath, that powerful sound was really capturing people's attention.
Wow. So there really was something for everyone. But did music play a bigger role, beyond just entertainment?
For sure. For a lot of students, music was a way to express themselves, even rebel a little. It reflected all those social and political changes that were happening.
Yeah, makes sense. Any particular songs or artists that really capture that 70s student experience?
Think about those anthems of protest and change. Marvin Gaye's What's Going On, John Lennon's Imagine, Bob Dylan's Blowin' in the Wind. They really spoke to the idealism and activism of the time.
Man, those songs are still powerful today. It's crazy how music can take you right back to a certain time and place. What about artists who push the boundaries, with their style and their performances?
You can't forget about David Bowie, Elton John. They challenged everything with their stage personas, those outfits, and that experimental music.
Sounds like the music scene was just as diverse and exciting as the fashion scene. Like, the 70s was this explosion of creativity. New sounds, new ideas, everywhere you looked.
Yeah, I like that. It was a time of experimentation in music and in life. Students were questioning authority, pushing back against norms, finding new ways to express themselves. But, it wasn't all sunshine and bell-bottoms.
Right, the 70s had its share of tough times, too. What were some of the things weighing on students' minds back then?
Well, the Vietnam War was still going on, and then the Watergate scandal, that shook people's trust in the government. It was a time of real turmoil, both socially and politically, and that definitely affected how students saw the world.
So these students were coming of age during a pretty uncertain time. How did that impact their outlook on life, would you say?
It definitely shaped their worldview, that's for sure. A lot of them became politically active, protesting the war, and fighting against other social injustices. They were passionate about making a difference.
That's really powerful. Seeing how those real-world events shaped their values, did this activism carry over into their school lives?
In some ways, yeah. Students were more likely to question their teachers, the administration. They wanted to be more involved in their own education, and they weren't afraid to speak their minds.
So they were really engaged with the world around them, not just sitting back and taking it all in.
Exactly. This was a generation that was pushing for change everywhere, challenging social norms, fighting for equality, and demanding a better education, one that was more relevant to their lives.
So we've talked fashion, social life, music, politics. But what about academics? What was it actually like to be in a classroom back then?
Well, imagine this. No laptops, no tablets, not even smartphones. Students relied on textbooks, taking notes by hand, maybe an overhead projector now and then. All the technology we have today, that just didn't exist in the classroom.
Wow, talk about old school. No Google, no PowerPoint. How'd they even learn anything?
It sounds primitive, I know, but it forced students to develop different skills. You had to pay attention in class, take good notes, and rely on your memory. You couldn't just zone out. You had to be actively involved in the learning process.
So they were really learning how to learn, not just memorizing facts.
Exactly. And libraries, those were so important. Before the internet, that's where you went for information. Students would spend hours there searching through card catalogs, looking things up in encyclopedias. It was a much more hands-on way to learn.
It's wild to think how much effort went into just finding information. But I bet it made it more rewarding in a way.
I think so, yeah. It made you really appreciate knowledge, the value of doing research. Finding information wasn't just a click away, it was a whole adventure. And that sense of adventure, that went beyond the classroom, too.
Man, we've uncovered so much about these 70s students. Bell-bottoms, protests, vinyl records, arcades, libraries. It's really coming together.
It just shows you how important context is. The way we learn, socialize, express ourselves, it's all influenced by the world around us.
Speaking of influencing the world, we can't forget about the rise of feminism and the civil rights movement. Those movements had a huge impact on society, and education wasn't immune to that.
Absolutely. The 70s was a time of huge social progress, and students were right there on the front lines, fighting for equality and justice. They weren't just watching, they were actively involved in building a better world.
It's inspiring to think about the impact they had. And it makes you wonder, what can we learn from these students? What wisdom can they share with us today?
That's a good question. I think one big takeaway is the importance of being engaged with the world around us, but also with our own learning.
Yeah, I agree. They faced a lot of challenges, but they also found a lot of joy in their experiences. They were passionate, resourceful, and they stood up for what they believed in.
Exactly. And those are qualities that are still important today, maybe even more so.
Man, we've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive. Platform shoes, disco balls, protest marches, even the library card catalogs. What a trip. But before we wrap up our 70s student adventure, I'm curious, what about the lasting impact? Like, how did these experiences shape the people who lived through them?
It's a great question. Growing up in the 70s with all that change and upheaval, it had to leave a mark. One thing I think about is how resilient those students had to be, how adaptable.
That makes sense. I mean, no internet, huge social and political shifts. They were fighting for their beliefs in a way we can barely imagine today. Those experiences had to shape them.
Absolutely. I mean, they learned to be resourceful, to think for themselves, and they really valued community, connecting with people, maybe more so than we do today even.
It's like they built this toolkit for dealing with uncertainty, And that toolkit, it feels even more relevant now with how fast the world is changing.
You got it. And there are definitely things we can learn from them, I think. That emphasis on face-to-face interactions, getting involved in real-world issues, even just appreciating those analog experiences, those are all things that can make our lives better today, even in our digital world.
It's a good reminder that even though technology is great, it's important to hold on to those basic human skills, those values that are timeless.
I'm right there with you. Maybe we all need to unplug a little more often, look up from our screens, and actually connect with the world around us, Be more present.
Absolutely. Find that balance, right, between digital and analog, virtual and real. So, as we wrap up our trip back to the 70s, what's the one big takeaway? What's that one thing you want our listener to think about? Some wisdom from those bell-bottomed, disco dancing students who were changing the world.
Here's something to chew on. Could those ways of connecting back before the digital age actually teach us something about navigating today's world? Could they be the key to building better relationships, being more empathetic, even sparking new creativity and ideas?
That's a really great question, and a perfect way to end this deep dive. Thanks for joining us on this exploration of 1970s student life. Hopefully it's got you thinking about the past, maybe even giving you some fresh perspectives on the present. Keep exploring, keep learning, and keep that spirit of discovery alive. Until next time.